Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. I'm Dr. Marie McNeely, and I am thrilled to have you join me today for episode 673 with our guest, Dr. Joshua Pate. As you know, listeners, through our podcast, we are working to introduce the world to scientists, science careers, and exciting science. And if you support our mission and you want to support our program, you can donate through our crowdfunding campaign at patreon.com/sciencepodcast or visit the support page of our website at peoplebehindthescience.com/support. Every dollar makes a difference, and we really appreciate everyone who has helped us over the years continue sharing the stories of inspirational scientists. And listeners, today, Josh has some stories of his own to share. So get ready to meet another one of our wonderful people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest scientist, Dr. Joshua Pate. So, Josh, welcome to our show today. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, and thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm looking forward to learning more about you and all the wonderful things you do during our conversation. But let me first start by giving our listeners a little bit of background here. So, listeners, Josh is a lecturer in physiotherapy at the University of Technology, Sydney in Australia. He is also a pain researcher, children's book author, and co-founder of One Thing, a video platform where pain experts share key insights that can help people with pain. Josh received his Bachelor's of Health Science and Master of Physiotherapy degrees from the University of Western Australia. Later, he earned a Master of Research and PhD in Pediatric Pain Science from Macquarie University. And Josh, today we're excited to get to know you more as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start by telling us what you like to do when you're not doing science?
Yeah, sure. I'm a husband and dad, and that's my favorite thing to do in the world. So I guess as soon as 4:00 hits in the afternoon, I like heading to the park with the kids and playing. And playing with my nieces and nephews and things like that would be my highlight. We recently went to the zoo and the museum. Those sort of days out are my favorite, I think.
Wonderful. Do you have a favorite game to play in the park?
At the moment, it would be hide and seek. But yeah, as the kids are getting older, it's becoming more elaborate.
I love it. Well, it sounds like you've got a busy family, a lot of things keeping you occupied when you're not doing science. So I'd love to talk about your science as well, though. How do you describe your research and your work to someone who's not familiar with your field and perhaps outside of science altogether?
We had coffee with friends on the weekend and this question came up and I was like, I'm a pain scientist, I'm a researcher, and it wasn't clicking and some of these words are quite foreign. But yeah, I guess I study the way that kids think about pain and then how that impacts on their life and on the life of the whole household.
Very cool. And I think a lot of people maybe associate pain and particularly things like chronic pain with adulthood, maybe particularly older adulthood. So can you talk about what kinds of conditions or situations are important to think about in the context of pain for children?
Well, chronic pain is surprisingly prevalent in kids. So from around the age 8 to 10-ish, it starts showing up. So as kids are entering what we call high school in Australia, around that like 10 to 12-year-old age, chronic pain can start emerging, same with adults, alongside things like anxiety and depression. And you spiral through all of these horrible experiences that each make each other kind of worse. And so the statistics are, for adults, it's around 1 in 5 adults have chronic pain, and about 10% of those have some level of disability due to that. And it's slightly less in kids, but certainly like for me growing up, I was not aware that there was a couple of kids in every class with chronic pain. It's invisible and challenging in that regard because there's obviously stigma that comes. And there was a paper recently published saying 22% of classes are missed because of chronic pain for kids who have it. And that's a lot. Imagine having 45 days off in a year. It's quite dramatic. So it's a big burden. It costs Australia, like pain costs Australia, I think that's $139 billion. And we're a pretty small country. So it costs a lot of money. And my thinking is if we can get it right, like if we can get pain care and preventative education right in the youngest age group possible, then potentially the downstream effects are that the burden will be less for the next generation. So that's kind of the dream and that's the big goal.
Absolutely. And I think this is so important to talk about. As you mentioned, it's a huge problem worldwide. And of course, helping kids and their families manage pain, I'm sure, is inherently motivating and exciting for you. But I love to talk about quotes and sayings and things that our listeners may be able to apply to their everyday lives to stay motivated and inspired. So, Josh, do you have a favorite quote that really motivates or resonates with you?
I remember hearing one. I actually don't know who said it, but I'm sure the listeners can Google it. It was something along the lines of accumulate small wins. And I think a lot about behavior change, and we might change the way we think, but does it actually change the way we do stuff? And often to cause behavior change in the long term, you need to have that sense of you have accumulated lots of tiny wins along the way. And those things compound and add up, like in the same way that interest on a mortgage compounds. Mm-hmm. These beneficial kind of like chipping away at strategies, things like exercise or learning, they compound over time. And I think that's really exciting and that's motivating in the daily grind. Like to do a little bit each day does add up. I read a thing saying 1.02 to the power of 365. So like if you improve by 2% every day for 365 days, the number's like 38 or something like, so it's like a huge compounding effect if you just do a tiny little bit more each day. So to me, that's motivating. And I think that's really exciting.
Absolutely. I think for myself, building in those little rewards and celebrating the small victories really keeps me going when I'm feeling frustrated or like really struggling through a problem. So I think that is a great quote. Now, in terms of role models, I know as scientists, you encounter a lot of people along the course of your training. So for you, are there particular people who really rise to the top of your mind who had a big impact or maybe that you looked up to or served as role models?
There absolutely are. I think probably the main ones would be my PhD supervisors. And just because I got kind of that window into their life during those few years of seeing how they balance family life and research and teaching and doing all these different things. For me, just that was such a foreign new idea to see how that all works. And so, yeah, there absolutely were role models. And then I think specifically there's people like I'm really interested in language and how people like the metaphors underpinning the way we talk about pain. Like we might use the phrase pain killers. So the metaphor under that would be like that pain is an enemy. So there's thinkers out there. One particular person is David Butler, who's just really, really clever at making information sticky and helping with that education. So I reckon I could list 100 people there, but they are some of them and they're all wonderful people.
Oh, phenomenal. And I'm glad you mentioned this idea of work-life balance. You mentioned earlier that you're a husband, you're a dad, you're balancing a lot at the moment. So what helps you keep everything on the plate and keep everything moving forward?
My wife? I think I spend a lot of time thinking about efficiency. Like when I'm in work mode, I'm in work mode. And when I'm not, I really try to not be in work mode. So turning off notifications and not checking my phone. And I think that gives me this excitement because I really like my work. It's that thing of going, oh, well, I don't get to do it anymore until then. It means things like meetings. It's like, oh, well, the time's up on that meeting. Like we've got to go to the next thing. So it helps prioritize things. And so I'd say, yeah, if someone's really finding that hard, potentially just working out what's the most important thing to do in the workday and focus all your attention onto those priorities. But it's certainly an ongoing battle. And I know lots of senior researchers who are still going through the ongoing battle. So I'm not in any way thinking it's a rosy path ahead, but that's currently the strategy that's helping.
I like it. I appreciate your candor there because I think you're absolutely right. It's not something that you just achieve and then you have this brilliant ideal of work-life balance. It's something that's a constant struggle, something you're constantly tweaking and trying to do better at every day. So let's take a walk down memory lane here, Josh. If you had to think all the way back to the beginning, when you maybe first started thinking about pain or first started thinking about science, where did it all begin for you?
So I had graduated as a physiotherapist, or in America, a physical therapist, and I was working, and the way I was trained, the kind of framework of thinking would have been called the biomedical model, which is where if you push on something, it will help, and the kind of really structurally focused understanding of experiences like pain. So I would see people who have acute pain, you do stuff, it gets better. But if you think about when someone is in an acute scenario, when do they seek care? It's when the fluctuating graph, it's when it's on the up, like when the pain is at its worst. And what comes after that is the pain's going to come down. So we see things like regression to the mean happening a lot. And so within a couple of years, you start thinking you have like magic hands or whatever. And I remember going to this course about education and the potential benefits of that in chronic pain patients. And me being frustrated with patients who didn't get better and going, well, is it their fault for not being compliant? So having this kind of interest, working as a clinician in a hospital setting and going, why aren't they getting better? And then seeing the very first patient, I remember so clearly when they got better and I didn't have to push on anything or do any physical modalities, I was just gobsmacked that at 1 year later, they were still doing really well. And if anything, they were doing better because they weren't reliant on someone doing something to them. They had developed self-efficacy and kind of had this foundation of education to rely on when things were hard. Because we know pain is often a recurrent issue. So if you can learn how to kind of prevent and overcome that, it doesn't cost as much money, it doesn't burden you for as long or any of those issues. So that was really transformative to me. And seeing that and going to that course, it made me read more. And then it made me think, hang on, I need to contribute to this research effort. Like there is so much we don't know. And now years later, if anything, there's even more that I think we don't know. But I think we're chipping away at it. And science has certainly moved in the pain world in the last 20 years to think more biopsychosocially, more holistically about the human and about pain as a feeling rather than pain as like a thing that you just get rid of.
Absolutely. So for you, when you went back, you had this realization that you wanted to contribute to research and then went to get a master's degree and then a PhD degree. What was that transition and that experience like for you kind of going back to school?
I had a really good experience. So I don't want to pretend that this is everyone's experience, but basically one of my clinical mentors was also, she just finished a PhD and she said, oh, we've got some funding. You can do a master's of research part-time and we can reduce the clinical role. And so I was doing 3 days clinical, 2 days research for a few years. And that was a nice balance. And the way that it was sold to me was it's a taste test. It's like, oh, we'll see if you like research. And I got to have the other mentor on my team was a brilliant, world-renowned physiotherapy researcher. So it was like, at the very least, I'm going to learn a lot from these guys. But yeah, I loved it. And the idea of sitting in a room and having conversations about stuff that has never been discussed before is just really cool. Like just to think this is what scientists get to do all the time. It's like, well, what are we going to do with these results? Like no one's ever said this before. How do we phrase it and how do you explain it and all of that stuff? And I really like that. So within about a year of starting my master's, I was pretty confident I wanted to go and do a PhD. And some of those clinical questions were becoming clearer in my mind of what I wanted to look at there. And then it's funny, as my PhD went along, I had viewed a PhD as this enormous summit and that's the end goal. And now I think of a PhD like an apprenticeship, someone who's becoming an electrician or something would do to trade. So you're learning to become a researcher. So now I very much see myself as junior and learning this process. And it takes decades to get good at writing and thinking systematically and rigorously. So it's been an interesting journey of, I guess it's maturing to some degree. But yeah, it always feels like there's such a long road ahead, but absolutely loving it.
Definitely. So you had this clinical background going into the master's and the PhD program. You got all these new research skills. As you were approaching the end of your PhD, this is often a sticking point for a lot of trainees out there. How did you decide what you wanted to do next and where did you go next?
So I was still working a little bit clinically in an adult pain clinic and running group pain management programs. And there was a potential opportunity to keep staying in that role and add research to the role. But yeah, obviously it's really tricky to change in these large hospital systems, to change roles and things like that. And then an academic position at a university nearby came up and it was with some colleagues I knew and I took that. And so now I teach and do research and service and engagement, lots of different stuff. So I've kind of entered that world of academia. And it's another steep learning curve a few years in now. And I guess it was a matter of rather than waiting for opportunities to appear at the end of the PhD, I would have been halfway through trying to make several opportunities and see what could come of different things. And yeah, I'm sure everyone knows it's always who you know and getting to know as many people as you can, putting yourself out there is worth it. And that was certainly the case for me.
Definitely. I think being open-minded and willing to think about different opportunities is really important, as well as you mentioned, building that network cannot be underemphasized here. And I know you've got tons of cool things going on at the moment. So is there a particular project, Josh, that maybe you're most excited about right now that you want to tell us about in some more detail?
I mentioned earlier about this idea of preventative education. So in my PhD, we developed an assessment tool to try and target this education. So rather than telling everyone everything that it says in these complex textbooks about how nociception works or neuroplasticity or whatever, it's kind of like, what's the minimum effective dose of education? And we're getting closer to that, and working with young kids like 6 to 10-year-olds, you see really clearly what these concrete thinking young kids can grapple with and what's beneficial. And so we're starting to study that, but not only in kids with pain. The idea is that can we build this well-being resilience mindset in these young kids? And if you think about, like, we've done some studies with teachers and they want to engage with the mental health of kids, but at the same time, they say things like, well, I'm not a doctor or a health professional, so I better not talk too much about anxiety or things like that. The exciting thing for us is that pain science has this nice combination of neuroscience and also bringing in mental health, resilience, well-being strategies, that it's a nice vehicle to start these conversations with. So what we've been working on is a series of children's books for kids in this primary school age to learn different learning outcomes. So the first book, for instance, is about how pain is not in proportion to the amount of tissue damage. And you see this in lots of different scenarios, but there's an example, the little character, Zoe Zoppens. She goes on an adventure to her uncle's building site and a nail goes through his boot and he feels extreme pain. And it's based on a case report from the British Medical Journal in the 90s. And he goes to hospital, they give him anesthetics and knock him out and go to take out the nail. And they realize that it's actually gone between his toes. So there's this shocking moment where you turn the page in the book and you see, oh, he's actually doesn't have any damage. And then you sit with the kid and say, well, is the pain still real? And it's like, yeah, absolutely. Like, the idea is the messages from his eyes would have been so compelling that there was something really threatening. And pain is about that threat level, not about the amount of damage. And shifting that focus onto kind of a perceived threat allows people with chronic pain to start going, maybe it is safe for me to move. And they might become curious and give things a try, because there's no quick fix, there's no magic pill. But if people kind of keep demanding of their nervous system small changes over time, our systems adapt. So we're kind of setting the scene with these 5 kids' books. So we're going to schools at the moment. The books are about to come out later this year. And we're seeing which learning outcomes are kind of sticking with kids, which ones are most beneficial. And I think the thing that's most exciting for me is teachers are amazing at teaching. And us as health professionals should probably kind of let the teachers do the teaching. And so what we're doing is going in, teaching the teachers about the biopsychosocial framework of thinking. And here's some resources that are kind of shiny and looking nice. Run with it. And we're going to study and see how teachers apply these frameworks, because I reckon they'll do a much better job than health professionals do, just because they've spent years purely doing educational training. So we're really excited to kind of unpack and unravel all that complexity to see if we can cause this large scale conceptual change. And then the next goal after that would be to see if it causes behavior change. So I mentioned earlier that kids are missing out on a lot of school when they have chronic pain. Does a new understanding and a rethinking of pain and a retraining of the brain and the nervous system, does that cause behavior change where kids are then participating in sport and school and social situations? So there's lots of questions and lots of big dreams ahead. But I feel like we're on a trajectory where we can be really rigorous as a researcher, but then we also get to do all the fun stuff of actually working with kids in the school setting.
Absolutely. I think it's so cool that you're actually bringing this research into the classroom, and so important that we start kind of understanding at an early age how pain works. And you alluded to this previously, but pain sort of has its own language that we kind of need to learn to. I mean, even as an adult, if a doctor asks like, well, where does it hurt? How does it hurt? You just sort of have this word hurt that doesn't really tell you much about the pain. So how do you contend with this kind of whole language side of things, particularly when you're working with children who are maybe not too familiar with the vocabulary?
It's certainly very challenging. The classic example in an adult, I mean, it's about half of 50-year-olds who don't have any pain would have things like disc degeneration on a scan, on an X-ray, or like on an MRI. So if someone goes to see a clinician and the clinician says, oh, we should do a scan, and then the scan shows these incidental findings, and in reality, they're not necessarily harmful, like they're the equivalent of kind of having gray hair or wrinkles. But then the clinician hasn't had this training about language, and they just show the report to the patient that says disc degeneration or something, or like facet joint degeneration. And it sounds like you're falling apart and you're on a really bad trajectory. the natural response to that kind of information is to tense up and to stop moving. And I think that's the Western understanding of we want everything now, we want quick fixes. And that behavior then can cause disability. So if you are laying in bed all day, you can't work. And then if you do that, your nervous system is going to become more sensitive to movement. So then movements will hurt more. And it kind of spirals through, like then you have more fear and then more avoidance and then more pain and then more fear, then avoidance and pain. And this cycle is absolutely horrible. So the way you talk about your body and the way you talk about pain actually matters a whole lot more than we typically think, because it's not like the pain is coming from the disc or your kneecap or whatever. The danger messages are coming from different areas in your body, and your brain is having to weigh up how important it is to protect a part of your body. And that's where we want to focus. And that is affected by your postcode and all sorts of things like the weather, and all these little things kind of add up 1%, 1%, 1% to this experience where you then feel like, oh yeah, my back's been playing up, or I've got a bad knee or something like that. And you start casting it as the villain. So if you start thinking about your body as adaptable and changeable, it frees you up to want to do exercise and to want to engage in behaviors that would lead to a better quality of life and less pain. That's the goal, right?
Absolutely. And throughout our conversation, we've been alluding to some of the challenges you encounter with pain conditions and also with pain research. And I think in science, there is no shortage of a challenge here. So every scientist has days where it seems like everything's going wrong. So Josh, do you have an example of a time that you really struggled with something, or maybe you had a major failure? And can you walk us through what happened and how you got through it?
This happens a lot early in the first few papers I was on. It was kind of when pre-registering studies was less common and I didn't really know about it. So you set up an aim, you submit a protocol to the ethics, you start the study, you're collecting the data, and then you start looking at it and you might be running some correlations or something like that. And you start going, oh, but I could also look at this and look at this. And as soon as you've done 20 correlations, one of them will be significant.
Statistically, yeah.
Yeah, I think the big challenges I faced early on was probably a lack of that statistical rigor and understanding how to kind of be prospective in the way that I'm planning research. And fortunately, I've always been a part of several studies at once. So some of the learnings that are happening in one study kind of translate across. And it's an ongoing journey. But I think in those early days, just having that struggle of going, okay, I've got this really broad aim. What are we going to put in the paper? Like I could write this, I could put this in, I could do this. I'm still not perfect, but having these really focused aims and running analyses that directly relate to the aim and not stepping beyond that, you're kind of minimizing the likelihood that there's chance as a finding. For me, that's been the biggest challenge. That's a pretty steep learning curve to get to the end of a project and be like, oh, we shouldn't have done it that way. But yeah, that's the beauty, I guess, of science, is that we kind of learn by finding out what doesn't work and then we build from there.
Absolutely. And I think this is not going to be a foreign concept for a lot of our trainees who are listening out there. I think this curiosity can get the best of you and you just want to look at everything. But as soon as you start opening Pandora's box there, it's sort of a slippery slope. There's no end to it. So I think that can be a tough lesson to learn. Were there particular things that really helped you learn it and sort of pare down how you were approaching these questions?
Yeah, I think it's about having good teams and mentors available. And I guess when I say that, I more mean at each project level. So we did a qualitative study and had a really well-known qualitative research expert on that team of authors. And with that, you then have a much more rigorous methodology and paper by the end of it, and you can be more confident of the results. Without that, you kind of lack that. So I guess the encouragement would be to find who's really good at answering the question you have and ask them early before you submit your protocols, before you register them. Get these people on your papers and invite them. They're all humans. They want to be involved. And often these really senior researchers love hearing from everyone about their work. So I was quite reserved and not wanting to chase people necessarily. But over the last few years, I've realized that it's so fun to chat about what people love chatting about. And often these senior researchers have such a niche topic. So find those people and ask them all about it until they're happy to answer those questions. I guess don't take up too much of their time, but
sure.
The power of asking for 10 minutes rather than a half an hour meeting is certainly impactful for my life. I just think there's so many people now that we have the internet and we can find people in these niche areas. Why not? why are we trying to compete in a bad, unnecessary way? Like we should be working together and collaborating more.
Definitely. And I think going to people with these questions are sort of acknowledging that you recognize their expertise, and that can always feel good. So I think people like that. Well, listeners, don't be shy about asking for help in your own research. And Josh, we appreciate you walking through one of these difficult time points in your career, but I know you've had many successes to celebrate as well along the way. And we mentioned the importance of celebrating these small wins. So do you have a favorite small victory or a large victory that you'd like to share with us today?
I guess the very first time a paper is published, it just feels like you've climbed Everest. I mean, I haven't climbed Everest, but it just can feel like this monumental battle of going to peer review and then it's rejected, and then you go to another place and rejected. And that kind of ongoing battle with papers, but becoming so familiar with just constant failures and rejections and not taking those things personally, but realizing that's part of becoming a rigorous member in the scientific community. That is liberating, and that is a success in the sense that now I don't know, 20 something papers in, lots of papers under review. Those kind of experiences are just so much more normal and typical. And so then not letting it get to me at all and just going, well, that's all right. Next, we're going to try this. And the next study we'll plan is this. And one of the exciting things for me has been being able to work in the communicating to the public space. So I've worked with TED Ed. They make animations that have millions of subscribers. And so I've written for a few of those animations and the kids' books with Noi Group. So just getting to collaborate with people who are absolute experts at different areas of creating educational resources has just been brilliant. So rather than me making a PowerPoint and saying, oh, this is about the builder with the nail in his boot, letting a producer and a director and a narrator and a team of animators, letting them run with it. And then you see this 26-second clip and it's just mind-blowingly cool. Or like with the kids' books, if I had tried to self-publish, which I almost did, the main character would have been an adult. And we've just learnt so much over the years of being able to work with experts that if we're making a kids resource, the main character should be a kid.
Right.
Some just really obvious things now were not obvious because you get so caught up in the kind of scientific academic way of thinking that you can forget about the end user. So in our lab, like we invite consumer representatives onto grant applications and into meetings as much as possible. So for me, keeping that clinician and like I do interviews with kids a lot, these kind of things keep it real and relevant rather than theoretical. My preference is to be in that space and think about dissemination. So that's even more important then. But yeah, I guess that's something that's really stood out to me lately.
I think that's wonderful. I think it's so important to bring that research to the public, particularly in this case. Like we mentioned, pain is such a huge public problem that a lot of people can relate to. But I think in some cases it can be intimidating for researchers to take that first step outside of the ivory tower, to make those connections, to start having those conversations. So how did you bridge that gap and make that leap?
During my PhD, I was encouraged to set up a website. And so it's like just joshuawpate.com. And so I set it up and I'm like, no one's going to look at this. And I set up Google Analytics and like one person every couple of days was looking at it. And I just had my publications on there, just some links. And now just seeing the exponential growth, I think for me, setting that up seemed like such a silly waste of time initially. And then within about a year, I'd start getting like a message maybe once a week from maybe a family who's got pain and they want to know where the good clinics are in their area, or they have questions about, I don't know, how does bioplasticity work, specific questions, or clinicians wanting to get the tool from my PhD, like lots of different common questions. And I'd start getting that. And that really became motivating of going, wow, like people are Googling this stuff all the time. Like it's worth engaging with and it keeps the focus so relevant. And I didn't realize that there would be that level of engagement. And so recently, the students that I teach in the Master of Physiotherapy program, last year, they said, oh, you should set up an Instagram. That's what everyone's using. And we're trying that at the moment. And to have that public engagement with the internet, for me so far, has been a really positive experience. And it allows conversations to happen that probably wouldn't ever happen. Everyone would just keep to themselves. And particularly in the West, we live such individualistic lives. And so to give people an opportunity to reach out and say, hey, you're doing research on this, you should be researching this question, is empowering, I think, for the everyday anyone, really. And I want to hear that. So yeah, I gone from being a very skeptical website owner to now fully embracing it and loving that engagement. And it's like you've got an extra, so I have my office door and my kids or whoever knocks on the door, But now there's like this virtual door, and that's accessible to literally billions of people. And so that's pretty cool. So maybe someone listening is thinking about whether they should or not. And I would strongly encourage you to do it.
Absolutely. And I love that you're making those connections with people outside of academia and around the world, as we mentioned. And we mentioned your children's books, and we'll definitely put these on our website for our listeners to check out. But Josh, are there other books that you've really enjoyed that you think our listeners should check out, whether they're related to your research area or completely separate?
Dan Ariely is an Israeli professor of behavioral economics, and he has a book called Predictably Irrational. And it's just like a series of one-page chapters from, I think he wrote in the New Yorker or something like that. People have asked questions and he just kind of answers them from a behavioral point of view. Very funny, really easy to consume. Just a really great read about how irrational humans are. Emotions are so ingrained in us and we often think they aren't. So he goes and speaks to people in the stock market world or all sorts of different fields saying like, if we think psychologically about this, you can be much more strategic. And even just in the mundane everyday tasks, like, I don't know, there's so many examples. So check out Dan Ariely's Predictably Irrational. I reckon you would have a great time reading that.
Oh, I'm excited to add this to my own reading list. Listeners, we'll put this on the website for you to find as well. And we appreciate the recommendation. And Josh, we've talked about a lot of different aspects of your career. And I think one of the things that's been disrupted, but is slowly returning, are the opportunities for travel that I think are such a big part of life as a scientist. So whether you're going to conferences and meetings to talk to other researchers or working with collaborators around the world, is there a particular place that your science has taken you that was just the most memorable for you?
A couple of years ago, I visited a pediatric pain lab in Canada, in Toronto, and it was winter for them. So I was coming from a hot Australian summer. And I remembered I've never lived in an area that snows. I've been to the snow, but never been in an area where it snows. And so I didn't have appropriate boots or anything. And I just remember getting up in the morning, trying to get to the lab and slipping over on the sidewalk all the time and just being that silly tourist. And then I guess the cool thing about that, like, is even as a real foreigner, you get inside the room and you're talking about the very same scientific questions with like-minded people, and even people who aren't like-minded, but being able to like kind of challenge each other and grow together as humans and as scientists was a really, really cool experience. There's so many reasons that was a great trip. Like, I got to see Niagara Falls, and I think being a scientist leads to lots of different opportunities that you just kind of never would have thought would have happened. And if I had stayed just only working clinically, that's very, very hard to have those kind of foreign experiences, like living in a snowy city.
Definitely. And I love this idea that you brought up, that labs are these sort of places where you can kind of feel at home no matter where you are in the world. And that's something I've experienced as well, where it just sort of, the community gets together, you're all talking about science and you feel like you could be next door.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's amazing. So are there any other sites that you got to see when you were in Toronto that you really recommend our listeners check out if they're able to go there?
It was a wonderful time. There was a conference in Montreal and I was down at Stanford in the US. So got to see just so many cool parts of the world. And even seeing, like, in Australia, we pronounce things slightly differently, and me thinking about the language underpinning these accents and every step of the way, it was just such a blast. So I don't think it's limited to traveling to just one place. I think it will keep growing as conferences return more and more.
Definitely. And I think working in science is amazing. It's full of these phenomenal, creative, funny, just quirky people. And this is something that I've really enjoyed about working with scientists myself. And I think there are stereotypes out there about what scientists are like. And people often have this image in their mind that just doesn't represent the people who are actually in science. So we love trying to break some of those stereotypes by just talking about the quirks, the fun traditions, the great memories that you've shared with colleagues. So Josh, do you have a story of your own that really captures this human side of science that's fun and funny?
I suppose even just visiting when I was over in North America, seeing it's normal over there for health professionals to be wearing white coats. And in Australia, it's totally not. And that's what people in labs would wear. And just those kind of things become almost comical because it's like, oh, that's what we see in a cartoon or on a TV show. There's just different, I guess, cultural differences there. And I can think of, I don't know, there was one team a part of where when it's your birthday, you bring your own cake and thinking it's a weird concept. But maybe that's a good thing. And as you say, yeah, people are variable and great. And I think it's worth trying to be vulnerable and engaging as best as possible with all sorts of different people rather than just people who are similar.
Definitely. I suppose if it's your birthday and you bring your own cake, you know you're going to like it. So that is an upside there.
Yeah, I think maybe that was it. Maybe people were sick of getting given cakes they didn't like.
Right. So within your own research group there now, Josh, do you have any particular traditions or ways that you guys like to celebrate together?
We do, I guess birthdays is the main thing. Our team is not huge. I think there's about 10 of us. These last couple of years have been really busy with when you're not teaching, you're trying to get some research done. And when you're not researching, you're trying to get some teaching done. And so a lot of the interactions have become virtual. And that's a strange thing in itself. Thinking about how often, I don't know, say you have a half an hour Zoom call with someone. It's like, how many minutes do we spend having a quick chat and building rapport and things like that? So navigating some of those new aspects of the hybrid world that we're having to is always fascinating.
Definitely. Well, it sounds like you've got a great research group there, and you guys are tackling some really important questions there in the lab. And I know oftentimes things like funding, staff, technology, feasibility, time, the list could go on, often limit what you can do in terms of your research. So, Josh, if we took away all of the barriers and gave you everything you could dream of, is there one particular question that you would want to tackle first?
I would love to see if we could roll out this preventative education across the globe to every single person. Not only then could we tackle questions about equity and access, cultural language barriers, all sorts of stuff, but we could do a longitudinal study and see, does giving the education at, say, age 8, does that change the prevalence of pain at, say, age 28 or something like that? That data would be so informative. It would allow us to unravel so much of what's needed to understand. And I think at the moment, so much research gets done is cross-sectional and we trying to look for associations and things. And you're just like, oh, it's not the same. Like we want to be able to help people long-term and not just see if the way they think relates to their current behaviors. Like it probably does. And it's hard. As you say, there's so many constraints and our world is kind of set up of training new students constantly, and then they're learning the ropes. And so the studies may not be completely rigorous. And some of that stuff is really challenging. And I think if I could do that, that would then set the stage for going, okay, well, what is the essential part of this education that can help people to live their best possible life in terms of dealing and tackling the battle of chronic pain?
I love it. Kind of identifying those active ingredients and maybe even acknowledging that they might be different depending on location, culture, all these different things that you mentioned.
Oh, yes, absolutely. They would be. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for dreaming big with us on the show, Josh. We appreciate you giving me and our listeners something to think about today. And you have shared so much with us in terms of your insights and stories. We'd love to end with advice. So is there one piece of advice that you received at one point, Josh, that really helped you that you want to pay forward and share with our listeners today?
Maybe we go back to that accumulate small wins. Try and chip away at stuff that's worthwhile rather than trying to solve all the problems of the world. Find that niche, and niches are huge now. Like if you have a niche in Australia, there's plenty of people around the world probably also in that niche. So yeah, finding similar thinkers to try and tackle these problems is worth it. And if we can do it in a way that's motivating, so gradually building on each other's work, that makes a whole lot of sense to me.
Absolutely. Well, that is excellent advice for our listeners. Well, if our listeners want to learn more about you and what you're up to, Josh, what is the best way for them to do so?
Well, yeah, I mentioned earlier, I'm now on Instagram. So a lot of the world is apparently on it as well. But yeah, so my name is Joshua W. Pate on online stuff. So you can go to joshuawpate, Pate.com. That's the website. There's a contact form there. But yeah, that's the same username on Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn, wherever. You can choose your social pipe to get to me, or you can email me through the university I'm at is called UTS, University of Technology, Sydney. So if you Google some of the combination of any of those words, you should be able to get to me, and I would love to hear from you.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, definitely get connected with Josh. And Josh, we really appreciate you joining us and sharing a piece of your story with everyone today.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's been a pleasure to chat with you, and listeners, great to have you here with us as always. We look forward to seeing you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science.